If you think of it, our energy system is at 80% based on combustion. So we just burn stuff, the same thing we have been doing for 10,000 years. Of course, we are getting much better. All those things are getting efficient. But at the end of the day, we are still burning stuff. So electrification is such a huge opportunity. And I don't think we discuss that enough. And you typically will re-onshore your energy system, which used to be offshore because you buy fossil fuels or oil and so on, which is produced somewhere else. Now your energy is going to be much more electric, and electricity has to be produced more locally. So unless we start tackling those things, you will always get a lot of oppositions, because probably people don't realize that all those externalities were happening way worse, but somewhere where you don't see them.
Hello, I'm Bryony Worthington, and this is Cleaning Up. My guest this week is Greg de Temmerman, Deputy CEO of the Quadrature Climate Foundation, plasma physicist and long-distance runner. The Quadrature Climate Foundation was established in 2019 and has already pledged over $1 billion in grants to organisations and projects around the world. They're also a member of the Cleaning Up Leadership Circle. Greg has spent over a decade working on the world's largest nuclear fusion project, before switching to philanthropy via a climate tech think tank in France. In the episode, Greg shares his experiences in the world of fusion, some of the theories of change the foundation is exploring, and his thoughts on how to get first-of-a-kind projects financed. We also touch on the primary energy fallacy and the content of his recent TED Talk, comparing long-distance running to the climate fight. Please join me in welcoming Greg de Temmerman to Cleaning Up. Greg, thanks for joining us on Cleaning Up. It's really great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to kick things off, as we always do, with the first question, which is, could you introduce yourself in your own words?
Sure. Greg de Temmerman. I'm currently Deputy CEO and Chief Scientist at the Quadrature Climate Foundation in London. I come from the research world. I spent about 15 years working on early stage research. My background is mainly nuclear fusion. I also did some work on hydrogen generation and ammonia. So early stage things. I currently lead the programs work at Quadrature, which is basically animating a great team of people and trying to look at where can philanthropic capital accelerate the transition or remove bottlenecks. And I guess we'll talk about that later. I did work on the ITER project in the south of France. I was scientific coordinator there, which is currently the biggest scientific project in the world, also the most delayed and probably the most over budget, but that's another topic. I left research in 2020 to start a small think tank, and basically I wanted to have a bit more impact. So I was working on something great, but I wanted to have a bit more impact on climate. So I led a think tank based in Paris for 2 years, working at climate tech and early stage technologies. We did a lot of work on carbon removal. We did a lot of work on the primary energy fallacy, for example, and those things. And then I joined Quadrature at the beginning of 2023.
Great, fantastic. And so just taking a step back then, what led up to you becoming a plasma physicist? Was this a childhood passion for physics, or tell us a bit about that origin story?
By chance, more or less. So I graduated as a chemist, actually. I'm a material scientist by training. I wanted to do a PhD because I had a very great experience in research during my studies. And I wanted to do two things. I wanted to have some impact in the world. I mean, at my scale, obviously. But I also wanted to have a multidisciplinary topic. So I started to look for a PhD after my graduation. Found a great project in Switzerland, in Basel, which was about looking at how a certain specific element of the ITER project was going to last for a long time, and was at the boundary between material science, plasma physics, surface science. So it was great because I was really going into the multidisciplinary world. And I kind of stuck there for a long time, but it's also great because it was all about collaboration with many groups. So I learned a lot, did experiments on the biggest experiments in the world. So yeah, kind of a random route in a way, random walk diffusion, as a physicist would say.
And having worked then for probably over a decade in the field of fusion, what were your impressions? Because of course, there's an awful lot of interest now in fusion because if it can be cracked, we are a fantastic solution. But what were your impressions? What can you share?
Well, a lot is happening. I know the joke is fusion is in 30 years and will always be, but a lot of things are happening. So I started in fusion in 2003, so a long time ago now. And We have seen a lot of progress in both computation. We have now access to much more powerful computers. Fusion is a very complex problem. So if you want to simulate a fusion plasma, so fusion hot gas, it's really complicated. You have to deal with a lot of non-linearities, and it really requires some of the most powerful computers in the world. So in 15, 20 years, we have seen a big progress there. What is interesting is, as you know, for any technology to actually make it, you usually need a couple of bricks to come together, right? I mean, we say that we innovate on the shoulders of giants, and that's exactly there. So for a long time, we kind of missed different parts of the puzzle, and they seem to be now getting together. I mean, one example, for example, we would not have an iPhone now if we didn't have a transistor, if we didn't have lithography to actually do small chips and so on. Well, fusion is also the same, kind of building on decades on research and progress. And a couple of breakthroughs have happened in the last 5, 10, 15 years. High temperature superconductors, which is basically what limits fusion is the ability to generate strong magnetic fields. So now we can get much more powerful magnets, which makes those things more powerful, give much better performance. It also allows us to have smaller machines. If you look at the ITER project, it's a gigantic project, which is really hard to industrialize and to build. So this is the first one. 3D printing or additive manufacturing is another one where you can start building things with very complicated shapes and slightly easier engineering. So it opens a lot of opportunities in how you can do that. And I don't like AI as a word, but machine learning has been something transformational in trying to understand better how things are going. Machine learning is about looking at huge sets of data, which is typically what we get in a fusion experiment, analyzing them and trying to progress faster in different things. The other thing which happened is also private investors coming in the last 10 years, although the first startup is actually really old, was founded in 1998. But recently, in the last 5, 10 years, with the likes of Bill Gates coming, a lot of money has been raised by companies. And the field went from the 70s, where people were looking at a lot of different concepts in parallel, and things narrowed down because money became scarce, experiments became more and more expensive. And now we see another expansion where people are starting to look at ideas which were looked at on paper, but nobody actually looked at in details, or just things that were abandoned because there was no funding. So you see kind of a flurry of things happening, a new generation of people coming in. So it's quite exciting. Does it mean it's going to work soon? It's another question. But I think we are getting close to the point where we can envisage that power production from fusion will become a reality. And also, what happened 2 years ago is, for the first time in history, we demonstrated in the lab that we could produce more energy from fusion than we actually needed to generate it. And this is something we have been running around after for about 70 years. It's a huge breakthrough, far from what you need from a reactor, but it does show that we actually understand it and we can do it.
Yeah, and that kind of breakthrough is hugely important, right? Because it's not, there's a lot of energy going in at the moment. And how long will we be able to sustain that positive output relative to the energy going in?
So the experiment which was done in California was only a few nanoseconds, so typically a billionth of a second, but that's fine because that's the way it works. These are small implosions that you do like 10, 20 times a second. So that's by principle. And then it all depends on what kind of principle you use as a reactor. Some reactors will work 24/7. Some will work with impulsion coming regularly. But I think what is important mainly is that once you start producing more energy than you inject, you enter a new area of physics where the reaction is heated by itself. And that's a whole new thing that we never could study before experimentally. So now we get much more data. We show that we can actually understand much more what is going on. We produced 2 years ago also a record of how much energy, so instead of power, just quantity of energy produced in an experiment. And for the first time in history, we're able to predict that within 20 to 30%. So we are getting way better at understanding the whole physics, and now it's more of the engineering and building things. And the ultimate question being, how cheap can you make that? And that's, of course, a long-term question.
And I suppose because although it doesn't have the same characteristics as nuclear fission, I mean, there's a lot going on, and it's pretty extreme physics, right? And are there concerns about material damage and neutron bombardment? And these are all going to be expensive things to crack, right?
Yeah. So I mean, my experience is in trying to understand how materials are going to sustain those conditions. Basically, the type of conditions you're expecting are way worse than anything re-entering the atmosphere. If you remember all those, I mean, even Starship, when Starship comes back into the atmosphere, it's all red, it's glowing. the kind of heat fluxes there are like 10, 20 times lower than the ones we had to deal with in a fusion reactor. And Starship does that for like a few minutes. You need to do that for hours, for even years and decades. So yet it's a big challenge. There are a lot of innovation coming there also. For example, using liquid metals, because then they don't get damaged, they get replenished by themselves. There's a lot of things going on in neutronics and trying to make materials more resilient, but also in trying to separate the functions. So the materials being exposed to neutrons are actually not load-bearing, which means the thermomechanical constraints are different, and then you can engineer different. So there's a lot of things that you can do. It's not cracked for everything, but it's getting there, and we have more tools. And material science is actually an area where there is a lot of innovation right now. AI is great in trying to test many different things that we could not test before, or not at the same speed. So there's a lot of opportunities to get better there.
But having done that for a long time and had a ringside seat on this amazing development area, you decided to sort of change tack and move into think tank world. And what's behind that? You mentioned that you wanted to have more impact. Was that meaning more near-term impact?
Yeah, so fusion is great, and I had the chance to work on the biggest project in the world, which is quite rewarding. You do learn a lot because it's a gigantic project. 35 countries are being involved, so there's a lot of engineering. I learned a lot of project management and so on. At the same time, it's a very long endeavor, and I was not getting younger by the year. So there was a key question for me as to, do I want to continue there and potentially have a very big impact, but long term, or do I want to try and use my skills for something else? I was doing a lot of outreach on climate and energy. I had the chance to go to many forums, so I knew I could do something there. I also was versed in a very technical topic. I was used to actually trying to make it simpler for people. So I just took the dive, and I said, look, I'm kind of at a stage where if I leave research for a couple of years, research does progress, but not that fast. So if I lose 2 to 3 years, I can probably come back somewhere and find a job. So why not try that and see what can happen? Got in touch with an entrepreneur who was looking at creating a think tank, and we kind of teamed together and started that. And quite early on, we looked at climate tech for many reasons, because France at that time was still has a bit of an anti-tech movement which was going up. And we wanted to make sure that people were having a science-based approach. So looking at those with a rational eye, trying to look at what are the promises that things could bring, but also what the difficulties are. Because scaling a technology from scratch is extremely complicated. You need to start navigating something complex. You need a lot of innovation, investment into that. And then you need to think about the whole chain. So that's what we were trying to do. And the great thing about that is trying to get a bit closer to impact, although we are still learning. Talking about early stage tech, this was kind of near term compared to fusion.
And give me a couple of examples. So, but firstly, you mentioned there that there was an anti-tech sentiment was creeping in. I mean, would you characterize that as particularly French, or was it more, I mean, we've seen it everywhere, right?
Yeah, it is everywhere. I might be biased, I will admit that, but I think France is a bit more, the movement in France was perhaps more powerful or perhaps earlier. And there are a lot of different variants, but you have the kind of degrowth movement, which kind of wants to oppose anything. Then the traditional green movement in France was kind of against a couple of things. Also, we see that right now in the discussion about a train line, right? People don't want a train line, although it's something you would want. So there were a lot of different things, and it really started to take over after COVID for many reasons. There was also a very influential book published in 2019, I think, in France about collapse. So people were starting to think about the collapse of society. What does it mean? And it had a huge influence on the kind of green movement in France. So a couple of things. The problem is that it was starting to creep into the public debate, but also into policies. And we wanted to just rebalance the discussion. Not that tech is going to change everything, but there are many things we just don't know how to do yet. And you need tech and you need new things to actually do. So it's like finding that balance between a lot of the solutions exist. Yes, they need to be scaled. There's probably a lot to be done in terms of being more efficient and consuming less, but there is also a lot of needs for new technologies, because there are things as simple as doing iron or cement, which we don't master yet without any fossil fuels.
I mean, it's similar to how when Cressida and I were setting up Quadrature Climate Foundation, but originally we wanted to take a very science-led, pragmatic approach And would you say that's the continuing ethos of the foundation, that it's informed by science and is trying to be non-ideological about its approaches?
Yes, that is, and perhaps let me define what I mean by science-led. What I say that for me, being a scientist is knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know, and then trying to understand better what you don't know. So I think the way we try to work is by testing our assumptions all the time, looking at the best data. I guess we'll talk about that. There's a lot happening in the field, and people don't necessarily look at that. There are a lot of impressive things happening, a lot of things which are not happening also. So it's very important to kind of look at the latest data and try to find those trends, but also recognizing what we know and what we don't know, because then you can start taking decisions on the right level, or also just make some assumptions and then test them later on. So this is the way we are trying to work, or we are working. It's just being strongly evidence-based, but also making sure we always test our prior, because it's easy to fall into a bubble, right? I mean, you talk to people who think like you, and then you kind of easily get trapped into something. So always having this ability to get out of that and look at the system as a whole, saying, okay, well, what is it that we are trying to do? And I think the thing we're also trying to do as much as possible is making sure we don't focus only on one thing. I mean, solving climate change is going to require kind of pulling all levers that we can, and then combining different things together to actually induce change, which again kind of relies on you understanding how the system works, what are the signals you need to look at, and which things do you need to push on.
That focus on being kind of evidence-led, it does mean that certain times, difficult conversations have to be had, right? That there are some. I mean, firstly, I suppose it's a bit of a tragedy that climate has become somewhat politicized, right? That the identity politics of the left versus the right, climate's kind of been grouped into one side, kind of unhelpfully. And so, how is the foundation thinking about kind of overcoming that that polarization that's crept in? I suppose that there's now a backlash in certain quarters against even the science of climate change is being questioned.
I mean, there are many levels there. I think the first one that I need to just lay out is that when I say science, this is all across the board, right? It's not only art science, it's social sciences are really important into trying to get change happening. So I know sometimes people put things into boxes, but we have a wide tent approach around that. And indeed, everything kind of lives into a political world, which is making our life more complicated. There are a couple of things. I think the first one is to kind of understand where information is being used and how it's used, and where also misinformation is actually propagating, which is quite interesting. If you look at climate and you talked about climate science, yes, people still challenge climate science, but less and less in proportion. But then you see a lot of things happening around solutions don't work, or people trying to push really strongly on the externalities that some solutions can have. And of course, everything has externalities. So if you try to find the perfect solution, you'll never get anywhere. I mean, electric vehicles does require materials, does require something. The question is, are you actually going in the right direction, knowing that, again, nothing is perfect? So it's kind of trying to keep that in mind and making sure you have to kind of bring those data up and up again, which is difficult because it's easy to say an electric vehicle doesn't work or doesn't reduce emissions. It's harder to actually prove everything through a life cycle analysis. The other thing is, as you said, the political polarization is very difficult for a couple of reasons. First of all, we are living on short cycles now where things can change from one election to the other, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. So you have to kind of navigate that. The other thing is also trying to find the places where people agree on climate, even if they don't agree on something else. So trying to find arguments for the right and the left to actually understand that they both need to act on climate, although they don't necessarily share the same motivation for that. They probably don't agree on the solution. So it's kind of trying to find a bit of a transpartisan approach, which is hard, and it's getting harder and harder. And there are also some kind of red lines you don't want to cross because there are some topics which are difficult. But I'm not pretending to have the solution, but it all has to be considered whenever you want to do something, which is why you have to try and play with different instruments as much as possible and kind of engage with different partners.
I mean, you said that you hinted at there might be some conversations that are too difficult to be had, but you've been quite bold in having conversations about geoengineering. I mean, carbon removals is not really seen as controversial anymore, I don't think, but that there's a debate about how much you can rely on it, how effectively it can scale. And then on the geoengineering, for some people, that's just, beyond the pale, can't go there. But the foundation continues to support those conversations, right?
Yeah, I think it's so. Our theory of change relies on the fact that climate is changing fast, and the reality we kind of thought of 10 years ago has evolved. Emissions still keep increasing. We just got the latest numbers now. Impacts are increasing really quick. So we also have to start being a bit pragmatic about what can happen and what needs to happen. Carbon removal 20 years ago was probably not thought as something necessary. Now this is seen as necessary. We can discuss how much. I mean, nobody really knows, and depends on what scenario you take and so on. But I think people kind of realize that you need it, but you start from zero. So you need to start scaling that up. And what does that mean? What does that mean to have actually permanent removals, which are also high quality? So there are a lot of questions there. And our approach is, let's provide the basis there, and let's allow for those innovations to actually happen. And a lot of those things are actually not really high tech. I mean, enhanced rock weathering is about putting some stone.
Sorry, I missed that.
You can't say that as a French. Enhanced rock weathering.
Enhanced rock weathering, yeah, sorry.
So, I mean, or using oceans in some cases, not necessarily high tech, but there's still a lot of science to try and understand, which we push, which is basically, do we understand the carbon cycle, how long something traps carbon for, and can we actually claim that this is compensating fossil fuel emissions? There are a lot of things happening there. But also, there are two other topics you have to consider now is adaptation, which is still something that many people don't want to talk about, but climate impacts are there. A lot of people are suffering. Climate migration becomes a topic. So you need to tackle that. And we think philanthropy has a role to play there. And the other one is, geoengineering is a topic which becomes more and more popular in media, although there's still not much money going into there. And our approach was, well, if it is going to become more popular and people are going to look at it because it might sound like a silver bullet, although it's not, what can philanthropy do to actually make sure that this is done and that we are crowding money? So our approach was, we don't have an opinion on deployment because we think we can't have it now. The science is not there. So what do we need to actually take a decision? We need to improve the science. We need to also start thinking about governance. How would it actually work if you decide to do those kind of things? So we decided to go in, fund the research, fund the governance work, and mainly trying to go there early to convince governments that this is their role. At the end of the day, this is something which should be publicly funded. Philanthropy is there to help, to catalyze, but it should not be relied on the long term. So it's the question of making sure governments at some point realize that this is important and in their interest to do it. The money goes there and we can go somewhere else. But that is difficult because as soon as you start touching those topics, people think, well, you are a tech bro who just want to inject particles in the atmosphere to solve climate change, which is by far not the point. So you have to kind of remind people that there is nuance in there. And the worst thing you can probably do is actually let things happen without even trying. Because if in 10 years from now, things are getting really bad and people start thinking about those things as, oh, let's do them, or we don't have any other evidence we need to actually say, is that a good thing? Is everybody going to benefit from that? How do we actually do that? Does it have any side effects we have to think of? And you can only do that if you start from scratch and from the science and thinking about how it would be implemented.
Yeah. I mean, we did a really interesting episode with Kelly Wanzer, Silver Lining, where we went into some of this. And another episode we did was with Anand Gopal from Energy Innovation. And those two episodes combined really convinced me that this is a topic that's going to require a lot more attention. And yet there is this kind of almost a consensus amongst some parts of the movement that this should be off the table and we shouldn't even do the scientific research. And the absorption capacity or the capacity in the movement for people to take a slightly different view. I mean, I don't know if you found this too, but when we were looking to grant into this space, there just weren't that many people, right? It's a very under-resourced area. There's academics working on it, but it's that task of philanthropy to sort of take what's in academia and then try and translate it either into the public or into policy and help achieve that. So how have you found granting into this space?
So first one I'd like to come back on, if you don't mind, is there's always an interesting debate as soon as you talk about carbon removal and geoengineering about if you start thinking about this, you won't be doing the emission reduction, which is interesting because if you really think of it, you cannot do you cannot compensate 40 gigatons of CO2 being emitted per year. So you have to actually reduce emission as much as possible. And it is always going to be more expensive to try and take carbon out of the air rather than reduce emissions. So this kind of moral arguments or moral hazard arguments saying if you do that, then you have a social license to operate for fossil fuels and you will never do anything. It actually doesn't work. Nobody is going to pay so much to actually keep burning fossil fuels. So there's an interesting thing about trying to bring that to a debate and say, nobody is actually proposing to compensate all emissions by removal. It's just impossible. The volume is so big. It's just no way of doing it. Same thing with solar geoengineering. You can actually show that if you do that in a context where emissions keep rising, it is actually going to make your task more difficult. So you're dealing with a climate which is changing and you're trying to change it back. It's not the best situation you want to be in. And you're not doing anything about things like ocean acidification. So you're only dealing with one problem. So I think it's always interesting to try and remind people that this is not one or the other. You probably need to do everything. Solar geoengineering will see, but then they are not mutually exclusive. Same thing with adaptation. It's not because you start doing adaptation, but actually you're not doing emission reduction because, again, climate is changing. If you don't do anything about the emission, adaptation is going to be more and more difficult. So it's an interesting thing that keeps coming back.
What's interesting there is what's the role of philanthropy versus other sources of capital, right? Because, as you said, governments have got a kind of natural tendency to respond to near-term risks. So in terms of adaptation, if you've got the wherewithal, and not all countries do, but if you can try to mitigate or change responses to impacts today, politicians tend to take notice, but it's these long-range risks that just build up over time that they're really not very geared to delivering. So I guess the role of civil society and philanthropy is to just try to keep balancing back to let's prevent this rather than try and fix it after it's happened.
Yeah, so I think philanthropic capital is interesting because it doesn't expect any financial return. So it's extremely patient, can take a lot of risk. You do expect some impact at the end of the day. So you're only looking at that, but you can take things which are more risky or longer term than anybody else would do. At the same time, it's a very small amount of money if you think of it. I think in climate this year, we are about 10 to 12 billion of dollars of climate philanthropy, which is nothing compared to what is needed. So it's hardly a drop in the ocean. But what you can do is try to be catalytic. So try to plug a gap when there is one, empower civil society, make sure that advocacy is actually funded, to try and make sure that the actors which in the end need to act, either private finance or whether it's governments, are actually doing it. But as you said, you need to sometimes plug this gap and ensure that governments also in some countries get the technical support they need. So all those things that are not going to happen naturally or will take a long time are areas where philanthropy can actually navigate. But it's always going to be a very kind of surgical instrument. The way I like to describe it is some grease in the wheel. So you're trying to make things happen a bit quicker, reduce some frictions. But at the end of the day, you're only going to be a small actor. But it's extremely important to make sure that civil society has something to say. And when you empower it, there are many countries where it's not the case. And when you create the conditions for dialogues also, sometimes it's just as simple as that, making sure people are put into a room and can discuss those things and you do a plan together. So it's trying to see where there are some gaps where nobody else is going to step in, at least in the short term, trying to get there and act as quickly as possible and hopefully unlock much more later on.
I suppose I interrupted you when you were about to describe the granting scene, because the other thing is finding new actors who are prepared to take a slightly different view, or because I mean the climate movement really emerged out of the environment movement, right? It was the big green logos who kind of raised the alarm, and then over time people have been realizing this isn't actually an environmental issue at all. It's a complete societal wide issue. It's an economic issue, and it's actually, you know, arguably now we're entering into the space where there's a lot of financial opportunity involved. So that sort of the actors who need to engage with this have changed, I think, since the early days. But how have you found, you know, just deploying of philanthropic capital requires there to be someone to accept it, like someone on the other end to be there, to ready to do the work. And we always found that was an interesting challenge, incubation of new approaches.
Yeah, so I think there are two sides to that one. In some areas, you could pour much more money and the field could absorb it. But at some point, it's a question of whether philanthropic capital is the right source of money, which should go into something. And in many more kind of niche areas, at the beginning, yes, it is a question of finding the right partners, encouraging them to create initiatives, but also helping them, because it's hard to actually start an NGO and does require a lot of support. And sometimes being very mindful about how much you fund something. Funding too much at the beginning doesn't really help. Like startups have the same issue. It's not because they get a giant check that it's easier to get through. And it's this question of how do you create ecosystems, and how philanthropy can help kind of accelerate a bit the creation of those ecosystems, making sure people have some chance, get platformed and so on, while not flooding something and thinking the solutions is fair. So there's this kind of balance between creating initiatives, and you also probably want to not limit, but you have to kind of think really carefully about how many initiatives should actually be working on something, because in some cases you don't want people to necessarily compete or kind of backlash at each other. So I think there's something about the kind of dynamics which you are creating where once you're a big funder. I think there's a question of being responsible also, which is whenever you create initiatives and you support them, well, financially they become dependent on the source of funding. So how sustainable is that in the long term? How long should initiatives actually go, depending on what their targets are? So it's kind of an interesting dynamics, which I'm still learning, to be totally honest. But there's a lot there. But the great thing about it is you meet brilliant people who have great ideas and who actually really try to do something in the world. And that part is really inspiring.
I guess there is always this tension, right, between backing something bigger and in the hope that will get you some kind of economy of scale, or backing a number of things, being more Darwinian about it. And as you would if you were doing a venture investment, you would back several to see which one emerges as the winning one. But yeah, these are all the fun things you get to spend your time thinking about now. And I'm guessing you take quite a scientific approach to it, right? So how are you applying your science brain to the challenge of philanthropy?
It's interesting because there's a part which is a science and a part which is an art. What I mean by that is, if I look at our theory of change for the foundation, we work on emission reductions. We know it's extremely important. We also think carbon removal needs support. And then we want to work on adaptation. And you can spend decades trying to find what is the right metric to decide how much money you put in one side or another one, but you won't get anywhere because you're comparing apple and oranges. So that part is kind of an art. Depends on how big of a leverage do you think you can have, how catalytic are you, what is the absorption capacity for a given field, how many other funders can you bring with you. So that part is, it's the art part. On the science part, it's more, what is the theory of change that people have? What are the assumptions they are basing it on? Which to me is the most important one. What are the assumptions? Are they spelled out clearly? Can we test them and can we learn from them? As in a startup, basically, you try something, you might have to pivot, that's fine, as long as you understand what has gone wrong and you can adapt from it. And when you're looking at the scale of a possible impact, knowing that it's hard to really know what is attributable to you, right? I mean, you know what you have contributed to at the end of the day, because you are never the only funder of something. So you kind of see what is going on in the world, but many other things are happening at the same time. Attributing anything to your dollars is hard. And we have actually backed down from doing that. We think it's not necessarily the best use of our time, because it will be at some point becoming a bit artificial, or also perhaps not necessarily aligned with our philosophy. So it's kind of trying those things, but questioning people all along in a way of helping them, not trying to be a judge or trying to think we know better than anybody, but just making sure that we go to the bottom of the theory of change and the assumptions. And once we are convinced with that, then backing people who need it.
Cleaning Up is brought to you by the members of the Leadership Circle. That's Actis, Alcazar Energy, Ecopragma Capital, EDP of Portugal, Eurelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, SDCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. That's cleaningup.live. If you're enjoying Cleaning Up, please make sure that you subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. That really helps other people to find us. Please recommend Cleaning Up to your friends and colleagues and sign up for our free newsletter at cleaninguppod.substack.com. That's cleaninguppod.substack.com.
So, Greg, you and I were both at a very interesting conference recently on the west coast of California, where we were with a group of investors. We were having a conversation about the sort of valley of death. How does the financial sector help companies through that? And first of a kind costs. How are you thinking about this area as a sort of philanthropic organization?
So the interesting thing about climate tech is in many cases you try to solve a problem, right? You're not developing a new gizmo or something which is going to try and capture a new market. You're trying to replace something which is working, and in many cases has been developed over decades. So in many cases you will come with something which is more expensive at the beginning and sometimes even less efficient than what you're trying to replace. So by nature, the market itself will never take it by itself. So it's something about how you shape a market to try and compensate for that and find people who are willing to pay the green premium, which might be also just pricing carbon. And what we see now is that many projects are coming to the stage where they need their first big factory. So the first of a kind is when you are getting into the commercial stage, you have been going through a lot of innovation cycles, and then you need to demonstrate that you can produce something at scale. But this is quite an interesting challenge for climate tech because, again, you're coming with something which the market doesn't take by itself. You need a lot of money. In many cases, you're talking hundreds of millions to actually build your first factory. So there is this kind of place where people think it's still too risky, or many people still think it's too risky. It's getting too big that venture capitalists can invest into that. So you're kind of in a gap where you're not fitting exactly in the investment ecosystem. Now, what can we do about that? There are many things. I mean, first of all, philanthropy is way too small to solve that issue. We have many projects coming up the pipeline. If you're always talking about hundreds of millions, I mean, you're going to be dwarfed by that. But the question is, how do you inspire more kind of trust or de-risk some of those projects to first show that you can actually do industrial projects which are changing or kind of trying to replace some big projects we have now. Think about iron or producing steel. How do you develop new technologies? There are many startups trying to do that. So the way we think of it is, okay, what can philanthropy do? Well, you're trying to build a big factory. So you're going to probably have to engage local communities, make sure that people actually are happy to have such a big factory on it. So philanthropy can help in shaping that and in making sure you engage with the communities. You can also do a lot of advocacies, making sure those projects are actually supported. They get visibility. They perhaps sometimes even get some tax rebates at the beginning to be installed, but they get access to the grid because you need a lot of power in many cases. So you can do a lot of advocacy at different levels. You can also try and find different ways to make sure that demand is materializing, so market shaping. So all those things that the entrepreneurs themselves could do, investors are perhaps less likely to do, but philanthropy could have a role in doing something there and facilitating. So we don't know exactly how it looks like yet, but we think there is a role to be played in, again, being this grease in the wheels and making sure you show that some of those projects are not as risky as people thought. Because if you just make sure that projects are not delayed, while you're decreasing the perceived risk, and if you do that, and if you see those big projects appearing, it does instill more trust. If there is more trust, more capital is coming at a lower rate, and then you're into a virtuous cycle if everything goes well.
And you're specifically there thinking about sort of almost like a concierge service at a plant level as a test of how this works? Because I can imagine capital would be used up, very quickly, and you couldn't do every single one. So is it trying to find lessons you can draw out and make more general provisions for first of a kind? Yeah,
so a concierge service is one possibility, which is basically centralizing the needs. And our thinking currently is if you can fundraise a bit and gather a bit of philanthropic capital and do 10 projects or 15, show that it works, then there is probably a model to be discussed about what else should be funding that. Perhaps investors actually can put a little bit of their fees into such a structure because it helps them a lot and increases their return. So this is the perfect example for us, or philanthropy can try something for a few years, for a few projects, show whether it works or not, adapt from it, and at some point find an economic model where it can actually be sustained on itself and not rely on philanthropy, because as you said, you'll always be limited in the number of projects you can assess. But again, if you go after 15 projects and you can show that there is progress on 6, 7 of them, that's probably worth having a lot of discussions about how this model can work on a larger scale.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And one of the things that might emerge, I'm just conscious about when we say, for example, if we're going to be putting new nuclear facilities into landscapes, it's actually probably sensible to put them into pre-developed brownfield sites, maybe, than try and take on a greenfield site. And it might be interesting to do a test of both, right? See which one moves fastest, what could be the grease in the wheels that helps, that philanthropy could support, and then extract that as almost like a kind of axiom for people going forward. I think the other thing that often emerges is with new things is insurance becomes very important. Like the insurance industry is very good at analyzing risk, but it tends to look backwards. And so if it's a first of a kind, it really struggles. And then from insurance, then you've got cost of capital flowing from that. So this kind of change to dealing with climate change, it's going to affect everything. It doesn't mean everything has to be completely rebuilt, but the service industries are going to have to change as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you have to think about the economics and making sure people understand things will go cheaper with time. So you have to take the blunt at the beginning and then increase the scale and the number of those projects so that things are actually flowing. So you cannot only look at the first project and make your mind. You have to look down the chain, and it's going to require some patience and also just understanding that the reason things are going to be more expensive at the beginning is probably because you don't price the alternative enough. So it's kind of a balance there. And then there is all of the question of trade, because you can probably implement some of those projects in areas where energy is cheaper, which is then opening a whole lot of discussions. And
in all of this, the assumption is, and I think this is probably correct given the current political climate, that making new things happen faster, like embracing new ideas, making new things happen more swiftly and more economically, is going to be easier than making the things we currently do more expensive. I mean, that I'm phrasing that as a question, I guess, but I can see how at the moment we've spent an awful lot of time trying to sort of price out fossil fuels in various ways, and I get the feeling we're hitting some headwinds, right, on that approach.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about showing that you have an alternative. So, I mean, electric mobility is the right one, right, where now there's an alternative. It is credible. It is now eating in other sectors. So used to be cars, now trucks are also probably going to be electric. So because you have something now for steel, people, talk about it, but we don't yet have a steel plant producing green iron or green steel. Cement is the same. So it's kind of a question of showing that there is an alternative. Once there is one, then hopefully it's easier for people to switch, although it's not going to be easy in any case. So, I mean, you have to phase fossil fuels and phase them out as quickly as possible, but making sure there is always an alternative in front of it is probably interesting. The other thing which is interesting is we have to accept failure. I mean, this is just going to be like that. Whenever you try something new, it's never going to work on the first try. Now, of course, you have to limit the number of failures because otherwise it's another issue. But that means you have to try different things in parallel. You have to accept that you have to learn and perfect things. I mean, the battery industry in Europe is a good example. It takes time to get a factory up and running and running really efficiently. So you have to just be patient enough to actually go there.
Yeah, and the reason we're emphasizing factories here more so than upstream mining or minerals or any other parts of the supply chain is because as you shift to an electrified economy, more and more your energy is being manufactured rather than a constant throughput of fossil fuels, which have to be dug out and shipped and burnt continually. You're putting in infrastructure, really, aren't you? And that infrastructure could be a factory, it could be cables, it could be grid connections. But we're moving into a sort of era of manufactured energy, not a fuel-based energy. So these site-based battles become much more interesting, I guess.
And this is one of the somehow paradoxical things about the energy transition is you need to build a lot. You need to rebuild an infrastructure, an energy system, and you have to accept that this means putting pylons because you need electric transmission, you need new plants, you need to have wind turbines close to your place probably. So this is something about, we can't shy away from that. There's something to be rebuilt, and you typically will re-onshore your energy system, which used to be offshore because you buy fossil fuels or oil and so on, which is produced somewhere else. Now your energy is going to be much more electric, and electricity has to be produced more locally. So unless we start tackling those things, you will always get a lot of oppositions, because probably people don't realize that all those externalities were happening way worse, but somewhere where you don't see them.
And it's interesting as well. So I wanted to move on to your TED talk, because I think around about the time this comes out, or maybe a bit later, your TED talk will be published. Do you want to just, for our listeners, just tell us what your TED talk, the subject of it, and what you said?
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about what we call the middle, the mid transition, or the messy middle, basically.
The messy middle, that's what you're, that's great, yeah.
Which is the fact that when we look at transition graphs, they're always nice, S-curves and so on. The reality is going to be more messy. And I wanted to try and find a way to represent that. The reason I think it's important is because we have to accept trade-offs and compromises all along the way. Sometimes we will have to do one step back to do 2 steps forward. And unless you start grappling with that, it's never going to be accepted. So I thought a lot about how do you represent that, and I happen to be a long distance runner, so I do trail running. I run in the mountains for hundreds of kilometers and for long times. And actually, I figured this was an interesting analogy, because trail running is about a very long distance thing. It takes 20, 30 hours to get to your objective, and you just have to have a plan which is step by step, and accept that sometimes you feel bad and you slow down, and then you accelerate on the next one, and then you go up and down and up and down, and you face a lot of difficult conditions. So I tried to make the parallel with that, to try and make sure we could discuss those trade-offs. They are not, nobody wants to actually take a step back on anything. That's fine, that's fair. But in many cases, you don't have a choice. So it's trying to kind of grapple with the complexity of a transition, which I think we are not talking about enough. And I'm not trying to say this is too hard and we will never get anywhere. What I'm trying to say is, we need to have a plan, and this plan needs to evolve regularly. We need to look at how much progress are we doing. Well, if we are facing way too much opposition on something, how do we deal with that? Are we just forcing our way through? We have seen in France that that's not the way to go. So probably trying to step back and do something else. And yeah, this is exactly what you do in long distance running. You adapt all the time, but you keep your eyes on the prize. You always keep your eyes on, this is where I want to go. This is the finish line. Trying to go there as quickly as possible, and I'm trying to do it by taking all those compromises into account.
So you were kind enough to let me have a little sneak preview of it. And I thought it was a lovely analogy. One thing it struck me though, as I was listening to that description, was it is a little bit more difficult than just you and your backpack and your shoes running off into the landscape, because there are active people who is going to stand to lose from this transition. And a bit like there's a popular cartoon called The Wacky Races, where your plucky contestants are trying to get to the finish line, but there's all sorts of people around trying to put deviation signs, come this way, and take you down false routes, or throwing tacks in front of you to puncture your tires. And that feels to me like the analogy that we're in at the moment. We're in the middle of the wacky races, and there are diversion signs being put up. There's active disinformation, and I do think as a movement, we've got lots of great things in our favor. But that forcing factor of narrative chaos, active disruption of the transition, I can't see that going away for a while yet. I think it will subside as the alternatives become more obvious. But we're probably at the heat of the debate right now, aren't we?
Yes, I think it's one of the things I try to talk about in the talk, which is there are a lot of paradoxical situations. For example, if you look at mining, you will need to do mining, which has a lot of impact locally, but this is to try and solve something globally. So how do you deal with those things? And then, as you said, there's the question of losers and winners, which is why I'm always getting a little bit uncomfortable with the discussion that everybody will win from the transition. Globally, perhaps, in average, perhaps everybody will win. But we know that in many cases, industries will close in some areas, and then you will reopen them in other areas, and people cannot necessarily move. So yes, I think this is the hard part, which we are starting to see, because people start to see their jobs disappearing. And the US is a good example, right? The coal power plants are not where you are going to install clean energy projects. So how do you deal with that? And I'm not saying I have the answer, but I think you have to really be mindful of it and really think of it. And especially policymakers should really think about how do we actually deal with that. I come from the north of France, where an industry has kind of has disappeared in a decade or so, and it has been really hard for the region to just recover. I mean, England has a lot of examples like that. So we know what it is.
What was the industry that was lost there, Greg? Which one?
So there was the coal industry first, and then the textile industry was basically all moved to China to do synthetic textiles. And then now the region is kind of bouncing back with really high-tech products and so on. But it took like 20 years, and for 20 years, people suffered a lot. And so what I'm trying to say is we have seen that in action before, that some industry can disappear from not one day from another, but within 10 years because competition, because of different things. So we know what it is to actually lose that. So we should really start thinking about how do we deal with that? Because if we don't, then you get more and more opposition. And in a way, it's kind of, I can understand why people will not. You can tell them that this is for the global good, but at the end of the day, their jobs are disappearing.
Yeah. But then this is where, as you said, it becomes more of an art than a science, right? Because what might be economically or technically the most logical thing to do, which might be we're just going to overbuild renewables in all parts of the world which are sunny, and then put massive cables in, and that's the most logical perhaps outcome. But in reality, it might not look like that. And there are some technologies where you're going to be probably wanting to develop them because of their social return. So if it's an old coal mining area, maybe geothermal or heat storage or anything that involves, that kind of putting things back into the community, it won't be the full replacement. But actually what we've, at this point in the transition, the number of people employed in the fossil industry is probably at an all-time low, just because of mechanization and centralization. So if we can crack the sort of social dimensions and the politics, it would be an insurance policy to allow then the more logical economic system to also flourish, right?
And as you said, in the kind of wacky race, we know that some automakers have a hard time catching up because they started from later. They were extremely good at optimizing ICE engines, and then suddenly they have to do electric cars. So it's really hard also to move against a target which is moving really fast. I mean, think about batteries. It's going to be really hard to catch up with China on some technologies because they have 10, 15 years ahead, and they are doing a lot of research and development. So it's kind of a moving target, and you're trying to run after something which is running really quickly.
No doubt. And that is where, you just saw some numbers coming out of China now that all global EV sales, there are Chinese manufacturers who weren't even producing cars last year who are now producing more than BMW in 1 year. I mean, the scale of it is going to catch a lot of people out in terms of how fast that Asian-focused new source of car manufacturing is coming. And it makes sense, right? If you don't have any oil and your balance of trade is negative because you're importing a lot of oil for transport, if you can electrify, you will, right? So that sort of all of those Southeast Asian and China markets, it's in their interest to electrify. And then obviously then they'll use domestic coal for some of that. So that poses challenges. But you mentioned at the very start the electric, the energy, the primary energy fallacy. And I think that's something that as we really get to grips with the fact that electrification saves you overall, you can still have, half of your electricity coming from coal, and it will still make sense to electrify a car because the electric car is so much more efficient than the combustion alternative. And once we get our head around that, I think that the signposts that are trying to take us off in different directions cease to be really that important because it'll be so clear the path we should be on.
There's something very interesting is how high-tech we are in some regimes. And if you think of it, our energy system is at 80% based on combustion. So we just burn stuff, the same thing we have been doing for 10,000 years. Of course, we are getting much better. All those things are getting efficient. But at the end of the day, we are still burning stuff. So electrification is such a huge opportunity. And I don't think we discuss that enough, showing how this is the right way to go. This is way more efficient. Our energy system is by far not efficient. Almost 2/3 of the energy gets lost from primary energy to useful energy, which means we are burning a lot of things for nothing, which is kind of mind-blowing if you think of it.
Yeah, totally mind-blowing. But listen, we could probably carry on this conversation for another hour, and I would love to do that over a drink maybe sometime. But for now, I'm just going to wrap up and say thank you, Greg, for joining us. I know it's your evening in the UK at the moment. I will let our listeners and viewers know that Quadrature is now a supporter of the Cleaning Up podcast, and you're a member of our leadership circle. I don't even want to say what inspired you to become a supporter.
I think the main reason is we believe strongly in creating space for discussing with as many people as we can. So trying to engage all parts of the puzzle. We know everybody has a role to play. It's going to be difficult for some areas. I mean, we talked about private companies. In some cases, transforming your company to be net zero, whatever it means, is going to be very difficult. So I think what we are very interested in is kind of getting those people on air, trying to make sure that they can be heard and they can not greenwash, but kind of be quizzed on what they are trying to do, and making sure that you are having as wide an audience as possible, but also as wide a range of speakers, so that people understand, again, this complexity and the fact that there are some people trying to do something. Some people are bad actors, some people are really good actors. So trying to create that and making sure that people understand those complexities is at the core of what we are trying to do.
Well, to the extent that we're able to help you do that, then we're very, very pleased to be working with you. Thanks again, Greg. I look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
So that was Greg de Temmerman, Deputy CEO of the Quadrature Climate Foundation. The capital requirements to mitigate, respond and adapt to climate change are vast, but philanthropy can play a pivotal role alongside public and private finance, especially if it finds highly leveraged points of intervention. And as Greg points out, it's going to be essential for all sources of capital to revisit assumptions, adapt strategies, and accept that some failures are unavoidable. We can't, however, afford to take too many detours down technological cul-de-sacs that the purveyors of today's fossil fuels might wish us to. Some solutions like electrification are so clearly winners, we should be running in that direction as fast as we can. As usual, we'll put links in the show notes, including to episodes 177 with Kelly Wanzer and episode 168 with Anand Gopal, where we explored geoengineering and carbon removals. My thanks, as always, to Oscar Boyd, our producer, Jamie Oliver, our editor, and the rest of the Cleaning Up team and the Leadership Circle who make this podcast possible. Join us next week for another episode of Cleaning Up.
Cleaning Up is brought to you by the members of the Leadership Circle. That's Actis, Alcazar Energy, Ecopragma Capital, EDP of Portugal, Euroelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, SDCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. That's cleaningup.live. If you're enjoying Cleaning Up, please make sure that you subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. That really helps other people to find us. Please recommend Cleaning Up to your friends and colleagues and sign up for our free newsletter at cleaninguppod.substack.com. That's cleaninguppod.substack.com.